Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the 9th week of our series, King Jesus. A series in which we are journeying together through a book of the Bible called the Gospel of Mark. And this week, we took a look at a story that is filled with betrayal and violence and a streaker. We find this story in Mark chapter 14. In the chapters leading up to Mark 14, we see that earlier in the week, Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem for Passover, and he spent the better part of the week teaching in the temple. However, the religious authorities are not the biggest fans of his teaching, and so they want to find a way to get rid of their Jesus problem. And so near the beginning of chapter 14, we read about how Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, one of the dudes who was supposed to have Jesus' back, makes a deal with the chief priest to betray Jesus. Now, immediately following that shady deal, we read about what is commonly referred to as the Last Supper. And at the Last Supper, amongst the many important and symbolic things that take place, Jesus informs his disciples that one of them was about to betray him. In fact, Jesus tells them that when the time comes, every last one of them would scatter and deny knowing him, which of course the disciples argue would never happen. However, what we see next is that after the meal, Jesus and his disciples head out to a place known as the Garden of Gethsemane. And while they're at the garden, Jesus asks Peter, James, and John to keep watch while he goes and prays. Easy enough, right? No. They fell asleep. And not just once, Jesus actually has to wake them up multiple times. It's really not their best showing. However, the third time that Jesus wakes them up, he delivers this message. He says, "The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." The hour has come, the stage is set, the lines have been drawn, and as we're going to see, there's a clash of two kingdoms that is about to take place. And so verse 43 reads this: "Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now, the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him, and then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And so what we see in these verses is that the mob moves in to arrest Jesus, and during this exchange, we read about how one of the disciples cut off the ears of one of the attackers. Now, tradition in the gospel writer John accredit the sword skills to Peter. And so our reaction might be to judge Peter, like, come on, man, you should know better. You've been following Jesus for 3 years. You should know that's not what he's going to want you to do. But you have to remember, at this moment, Peter's world is caving in. His expectations are being exposed. He wants his Messiah to lead a violent rebellion. He wants his rabbi to overthrow Rome. And yet, Jesus' cryptic talk about the cross is becoming ever more a reality. Plus, Peter is feeling so hurt and confused and frustrated, he's probably still worked up about what happened at dinner a few hours earlier. Do you remember? Jesus looked him in the eye and he told him, "You're going to betray me 3 times tonight." And so you have to imagine that Peter's like, you know what? I'm going to show all of you. I ain't no coward. And in a moment of bad judgment, he pulls out his sword and he shows everyone what he's willing to do for Jesus. He shows everyone the kind of Messiah that he wanted to follow. And yet, the Messiah he was following was very different. Was Jesus a violent insurrectionist? Absolutely not. In fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, when Matthew tells this exact same story, he records Jesus turning to Peter and saying, "Put down your sword, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword." And in Luke's gospel, when Luke retells this story, he includes how after Peter's act of violence, Jesus actually touches the man's ear and heals him. He reverses the violence. And so what happens next? Well, in verse 50, we read that everyone deserted Jesus and fled. And then in verse 51, we read the most seemingly random and confusing and out-of-place sentence in all of Mark's gospel. It says, "A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind." Well, folks, we found the streaker. Now, you're probably wondering, why is that verse in my Bible? Well, this detail is actually only included in the Gospel of Mark, and here's why. The young man who went streaking is Mark. the very writer of the gospel. It's his way of saying, I was there. However, Mark admits that he too failed his Messiah. You see, in those days, public nakedness was the ultimate shame. It was the ultimate humiliation. And so by including this detail in his gospel, Mark is publicly declaring that in that moment, he chose the shame of nakedness rather than the trial of Jesus. And personally, I think this gives a lot of credibility to the story, because can you imagine the humility of Mark when he's writing this? I mean, he has the opportunity to inject himself into the story, and instead of painting himself as a hero, he relays a moment of his deepest shame. He says to his readers, I was there, and I too, much like everybody else, abandoned him. He says, I feared the kingdoms of this world more than I desired to be a part of the kingdom of God. And that is the crux of this story. And that is the decision that this story is asking each of us to make. Which kingdom do we want to be a part of? You see, throughout Mark's gospel, Jesus is presenting us with this new manifesto, this new way of living, this new way of thinking, this entirely new kingdom. A kingdom is an administration. It's a way of ordering things and getting things done. Essentially, it's a set of values and a way of doing things. And what we see in the Gospels is that the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of God are operating off of two very different sets of values and two very different ways of getting things done. Generally speaking, the kingdoms of this world, they value power and wealth and success and recognition. And how do they achieve these things? How do they get things done? Well, they use force. If you won't bend your knee, well, we're going to bend it for you. They use coercion, like we will intimidate you into doing what we need you to do. They use manipulation. We'll make you think we're on your side just all the while getting what we actually want. And of course, they'll use greed. We're going to buy our way to the top. We'll purchase our power. And yet, in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see Jesus' kingdom stand in a stark contrast. Despite being the king of the universe, he refuses to accomplish things the way that every other earthly kingdom accomplishes things. He refuses to act in violence. And so what does God's kingdom value? Well, from what Jesus' words and deeds we see in the Gospel of Mark, we see that the kingdom of God values servanthood, it values forgiveness, it values humility, and it values compassion. And how does God's kingdom get things done? It's not through force, it's through love. It's not through coercion, it's actually through service. It's not through manipulation, it's through self-sacrifice. And it's not through greed, it's actually through generosity. It's a kingdom that is completely backwards to the kingdoms of this world. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, these two kingdoms and their values and their way of getting things done, they come face to face. And in that moment, we see everybody make a choice about which kingdom they want to be a part of. And unfortunately, they all kind of get it wrong. But this is the choice that you and I actually have to make every single day. Like, will we respond like Peter? Peter was so committed to Jesus' kingdom being what he wanted it to be that he continually missed the point. Peter's version of Jesus was one who took up arms, and so Jesus confronts him and tells him that the real Jesus is one who would tell him to lay down his arms. It's love, not force, that gets things done. Sometimes we respond maybe like Judas, and Judas fell victim to the values of this world when he realized that Jesus wasn't going to lead him to the type of power, success and recognition he desired. He chose to be a part of the kingdom that promises those things. And we fall into that trap sometimes too. And sometimes maybe we even respond like Mark. We willingly abandon beliefs and convictions we once held just because we're starting to feel a little pressure from the world around us. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Mark was so afraid of the kingdoms of this world, so afraid of punishment, so fearful of short-term suffering that he was willing to forgo long-term blessing. Friends, we live in a tension between two kingdoms. One kingdom appeals to our flesh. It tells us that power, wealth, success, and recognition makes life worth living, and that the means to obtain those things are often forced coercion, manipulation, and greed. The other kingdom tells us that none of those things will actually truly satisfy us, and it's a kingdom that advances its agenda by the way of love, service, self-sacrifice, and generosity. And so really stories like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and all throughout Mark's gospel are confronting us with the question, which kingdom do you want to belong to? Because you have to make a choice. You can't really have a foot in both. These kingdoms are too different for that. They value things far different. And so Jesus doesn't make that allowance. He asks for your allegiance. And so the question is, will you give it? Well, consider yourselves caught up. I'll see you next week.